Welcome back to Daily Gossip, the podcast where we usually spill the tea on the movers and shakers of culture. But today we are diving into a different kind of drama. It is a story of political hubris, corporate maneuvering, and a catastrophic miscalculation that is completely reshaping the global economy as we speak. I want you to grab your coffee, maybe something a little stronger if you are tuning in from the United States, because the gossip we are breaking down today, ISN and Oppos, tea about Hollywood. It is about Washington, Brussels, and the quiet boardrooms of the world and Oppos' most powerful industrial giants. If you are new here, or if you and Oppos' been relying on us to make sense of this chaotic world, please take a second right now to hit that subscribe button. Like this video, leave a comment, and share it with that one friend who is always complaining about inflation or the cost of building a house. Your support is the only way this channel keeps running, and it ensures that these deep dive stories reach the people who actually need to hear them. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let us jump right in. We need to talk about aluminum. I know it does not sound sexy, but stay with me, because what is happening with this metal right now is the ultimate story of unintended consequences. We are looking at a classic butterfly effect, except instead of a butterfly flapping its wings, it was a pen stroke in the Oval Office. In the spring of 2025, the Trump administration announced a staggering 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum. The stated logic handed down from Washington was remarkably simple, almost seductively so. The narrative was that the United States needed to protect American industry. The administration wanted to punish Canada for retaliating against earlier trade measures, and above all, they wanted to bring the good, hard-hat manufacturing jobs back home to the American heartland. The tariff officially took effect in June of 2025. And here is the kicker. It actually worked. It functioned exactly as a massive disruption should. The only problem is that it worked in a way that absolutely nobody in Washington intended, predicted, or prepared for. You see, Canada and Oppos' massive supply of aluminum did not just magically disappear into thin air. Furthermore, it certainly did not get absorbed into the American supply chains at a steep discount as some optimistic policymakers had hoped. Instead, that metal went to Europe. It went across the Atlantic by the hundreds of thousands of tons. And now, as we sit here in 2026, in the middle of a devastating regional war that has essentially shut down the massive smelters of the Middle East and choked off the Strait of Hormuz, Europe finds itself sitting on one of the most valuable industrial advantages in the entire global economy. They are hoarding Canadian green aluminum. Meanwhile, American manufacturers, the very people this policy was supposed to protect, are currently paying record-high, eye-watering prices just to access the exact same metal they used to buy from their northern neighbors at a fraction of the cost. This is not just a story about a trade dispute. This is the story of how one single tariff handed Europe a generational industrial lifeline, left American factories out in the freezing cold, and locked the United States into a structural supply crisis that it is fundamentally unequipped to solve. To really understand the magnitude of this blunder, we have to start with what Canada actually represents in the shadowy, high-stakes world of global commodities. For those of us living in the States or Europe, we tend to think of Canada for its maple syrup, its polite demeanor, or maybe its banking sector. But in the industrial realm, Canada is an absolute titan. It is the fourth largest primary aluminum producer on planet Earth, sitting only behind the heavyweights of China, India, and Russia. Every single year, Canada produces approximately 3.3 million tons of this metal. And here is the geographical quirk that makes all the difference. 9 out of its 10 massive smelters are located in just one province, Quebec. Now, the concentration of this industry in Quebec is not some random accident of geography or historical chance. It all comes down to power. If you know anything about aluminum, you know that it is often referred to in the industry as, and quote, congealed electricity. And quote, the smelting process which extracts pure aluminum from alumina powder requires an absolutely mind-boggling amount of continuous electrical current. And Quebec happens to have Hydro-Quebec, which is one of the largest, most efficient, and most robust hydroelectric power systems in the entire world. This sprawling network of dams and rivers provides electricity to these aluminum smelters at prices that are almost impossible to fathom. We are talking about electricity rates that are up to 3 times lower than what American industrial customers are forced to pay. If you want to understand the entire competitive advantage of the Canadian aluminum industry, You can condense it into one simple sentence. It is powered by raging rivers, and the energy costs almost nothing. To put this in perspective, just look at the Alouette smelter in Sept-Îles. That single facility alone possesses a production capacity of 632,000 tons per year. Let that sink in. That one Canadian plant is larger than the total output of every single American smelter combined. The major players know this. Alcoa operates 3 major smelters in Quebec at Baie-Comeau, Deschambault, and Bécancour. Rio Tinto runs massive facilities in the Saguenay, Lac-Saint-Jean region. For decades, the relationship between this Canadian behemoth and the American industrial machine was stable, deeply integrated, and entirely logical from an economic standpoint. In 2024, for instance, Canada exported nearly 2.6 million tons of unwrought aluminum. Depending on which data set you look at, roughly 70 to 85% of that massive volume went to exactly one customer, the United States. Canada produced the raw metal using its cheap, green river power, and America consumed it to build cars, airplanes, beer cans, and skyscrapers. It was a beautiful, symbiotic arrangement that hummed along seamlessly for generations. Then, Washington decided to smash it with a 50% tariff wall. Let us walk through the exact sequence of events, because the timeline reveals exactly how quickly a political miscalculation can trigger a corporate exodus. Back in March of 2025, the administration fired the first shot by reimposing a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum. The Canadian government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, did not blink. They responded immediately, aggressively, and surgically. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs amounting to 29.8 billion Canadian dollars, which translates to roughly 20.7 billion US dollars, targeting specific American industries designed to cause maximum political pain. Furthermore, the province of Ontario, which was facing immediate economic pressure from the fallout, slapped a devastating 25% surcharge on the electricity exports they send down to various U.S. states. Instead of backing down, the White House escalated. The administration threatened to double the aluminum tariff and went so far as to declare a national emergency to justify the move. By June of 2025, they followed through on the threat. Canadian aluminum was hit with a 50% tariff, effective immediately. If you read the tea leaves and the press briefings from that time, the assumption inside the corridors of power in Washington appeared to be that Canada would simply capitulate. The prevailing theory was that Canadian producers had nowhere else to go, so they would be forced to swallow the tariff, absorb the massive financial hit, and continue selling to the U.S. Consequently, American manufacturers would sit safely behind this protectionist shield, enjoying a revitalized domestic industry. Absolutely none of that happened. What actually unfolded was a masterclass in supply chain agility. The pivot moved faster than anyone in the White House, the Commerce Department, or the Pentagon ever anticipated. Corporations do not operate on patriotism. They operate on margins. And the margins were flashing bright red. Bill Oplinger, the CEO of Alcoa, dropped a bombshell during a second quarter 2025 earnings call. He casually disclosed to investors that since the initial tariffs in March of that year, his company had already smoothly redirected more than 100,000 tons of Canadian aluminum. This was metal that had been earmarked for long-standing U.S. buyers, but instead, it was placed on ships and sent to clients in other countries. When pressed on the call, Oplinger stated the reason with brutal, undeniable simplicity. It all came down to a concept called, end quote, netback, end quote. For those who aren't in oppos, commodity traders, netback is the actual amount of money a producer gets to keep in their pocket after deducting all the transport costs, all the logistics, and crucially, all the tariffs. Because of Washington and oppos' 50% penalty, the netback for shipping metal down to Detroit or Chicago had become completely unfavorable. Meanwhile, buyers in Europe who were watching their own supply chains get nervous were willing to pay significantly better premiums. So, the metal simply followed the money. It went to Europe. The numbers from the ground are even more staggering. Let us look at Alouette, that massive Sept-Îles smelter that is 40% owned by Rio Tinto. They disclosed that in the second quarter of 2025, Europe suddenly accounted for 57% of all their shipments. Compare that to just 4% in the first quarter of the year. I want you to really think about that for a moment. In the span of just 3 months, a massive, heavy industrial facility that traditionally sent almost everything it produced south of the border managed to flip more than half of its entire export volume across the Atlantic Ocean. The executives Warren and Oppos, even hiding it. Rio Tinto's CEO of its aluminum and lithium division gave an interview to La Presa, stating point-blank that the company had proactively redirected its production to Europe specifically to, and quote, maximize the value of our products in the current commercial environment, end quote. It was a polite, corporate way of saying, end quote, America made it too expensive, so we found someone else who will pay, end quote. The global trade data confirmed this massive shift across the board. If you look at Canada and Oppos' aluminum exports to the European Union between April 2025 and March 2026, the monthly totals ranged anywhere from 6% to a staggering 40% of all their exports. To put that in perspective, in the first quarter of 2024, that number was effectively zero. Europe wasn't and Oppos' even on the radar. But suddenly, in April and May of 2025 alone, the Netherlands took in 11,800 tons of Canadian aluminum. Italy absorbed 25,500 tons. These were markets that had previously received essentially zero Canadian primary metal. Consequently, Quebec and Oppos' share of exports going to the United States plummeted from its historical average of about 95% down to 78% between the first and second quarters of 2025. And I want to make something very clear here. All of this happened before the bombs started flying. Even before the catastrophic war in the Middle East erupted on February 28, 2026, Canadian shipments to Europe had already jumped 276% from their 2024 levels, exceeding 590,000 tons. The pivot was already complete. The bridge had been built. And then, the unthinkable happened. The war started. When the geopolitical landscape fractured in late February 2026, what was previously just a damaging and annoying trade diversion suddenly morphed into a full-scale, absolute global crisis. To understand why, you have to look at the Middle East. Now, when most people think of the Middle East, they think of oil. But thanks to that abundant, cheap energy, the region has quietly become an aluminum powerhouse. The Middle East accounts for roughly 9% of global aluminum production capacity. To the layman, 9% might sound like a relatively small slice of the pie. However, in the razor-thin margins of global commodities, it is massive, especially when you realize that almost all of that metal is built purely for export. The countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, specifically the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, operate enormous, sprawling, energy-rich smelters. They churn out millions of tons of high-grade metal and ship the output directly to hungry markets in Europe, Asia, and the United States. But there is a geographic choke point. To get that metal out of the Gulf and into the global market, it has to move through the Strait of Hormuz. When the coordinated U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran commenced on February 28, 2026, that vital waterway effectively closed to Western shipping overnight. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a chilling declaration. Any vessel attempting passage would be immediately set ablaze. Within days, more than 150 massive commercial ships sat anchored outside the strait, essentially paralyzed, unable to cross. The global aluminum industry felt the shockwave instantly. Let us look at Aluminium Bahrain, known as ALBA. They run the world and Oppos' largest single-site smelter, capable of producing 1.6 million tons per year. By March, they were forced to slash their production by 19% simply due to the shipping disruptions. They couldn't and Oppos' get their product out, and they couldn't and Oppos' get raw materials in. Then, the situation escalated from logistical nightmare to physical destruction when Iranian retaliatory strikes hit ALBA and Oppos' plant directly. The situation was equally grim next door. Emirates Global Aluminium, or EGA, is the Middle East and Oppos' largest producer. Their crown jewel is the Al Tawila facility in Abu Dhabi, which also runs at a staggering 1.6 million tons per year. They reported significant structural damage after a barrage of Iranian missile strikes in late March. EGA executives subsequently had to make a grim announcement to their global buyers. full production restoration could take up to 12 months. The analysts in London and New York went into a panic. Ava Manthe and Warren Patterson, lead analysts at ING, quickly calculated the devastating consequences. When you combine the complete halt at EGA and Opos, Al Tawila smelter, the severely reduced operations at Alba, and the earlier precautionary curtailments at Catalum in Qatar, it meant that approximately 3 million tons of production capacity had just been violently taken offline. We are talking about close to half of all Middle East aluminum production simply vanishing into the desert air. ING's revised estimate was terrifying for anyone who relies on this metal. They projected an immediate global supply deficit of 2 to 2.5 million tons. Over at the CRU Group, principal analyst Guillaume Lecoz issued a stark warning to the markets. He noted that because global stock levels were already running dangerously low, any further disruptions could easily push aluminum prices toward an unimaginable $4,000 per ton. The market reacted with the kind of violent volatility usually reserved for meme stocks, not foundational industrial metals. London Metal Exchange aluminum futures, which were already sitting at an elevated $3,100 per ton before the war due to general market anxiety, absolutely surged. By March 2026, they hit near 4-year highs, blasting past $3,450 per ton. We are talking about price gains of more than 10% in a matter of weeks. Over in Europe, premiums on aluminum billets, the specific form of the metal used for heavy extrusion and manufacturing, surged 16% in just the opening weeks of the conflict. The massive construction and transportation sectors, which rely on a constant, predictable flow of these billets to build everything from window frames to train cars, began signaling profound, existential supply anxiety. Michael Widmer, a top analyst at Bank of America, finally put a specific, terrifying number on the structural problem facing Europe. He projected a 5.6 million ton aluminum deficit for the continent in 2026. The overall global shortfall was hovering at 2.2 million tons, and America and Opos' domestic deficit was sitting at 3.8 million tons. But Europe and Opos' gap was the largest of all. And here is the crucial piece of context that makes Europe and Opos' situation so dramatic. This Middle Eastern crisis arrived directly on top of 2 other massive supply losses that the European continent had already been forced to absorb. First, the European Union had been aggressively phasing out Russian aluminum for the past few years in response to the grinding war in Ukraine. Second, South 32's major Mosul smelter down in Mozambique had been mothballed due to operational and energy issues. And then, suddenly, the Middle East went dark. That is 3 distinct, massive, reliable supply sources completely disappearing in succession inside a brutal 3-year window. Faced with a 5.6 million ton abyss, Europe had to turn somewhere. They turned to where the metal actually was. They turned to Canada. This brings us to the most vital realization of this entire saga. Canadian shipments to Europe are no longer just a temporary fix. They are no longer a frantic workaround to dodge an American tariff. They have become a deeply entrenched, structural feature of global trade. The fact that Trump and Opos' 50% tariff came first, before the bombs, before the missiles, before the Strait of Hormuz closed, is exactly what makes this story so unbelievably consequential for American policy. To be fair, the Trump tariff absolutely did not create the Middle Eastern war. It did not create the global crisis. But what that tariff did do with lethal efficiency was ensure that when the crisis inevitably arrived, the United States would be forced to face it completely naked. America had systematically alienated and redirected its most reliable, natural, geographically adjacent supply partner right before the world caught on fire. And this is where the American side of the ledger becomes incredibly dark and impossible to deny. The political rhetoric about, and quote, bringing the jobs home, and quote, sounds great on a campaign trail, but it ignores the brutal laws of physics and economics. As of today, the United States has exactly 4 primary aluminum smelters left operating within its borders. The total domestic production capacity is roughly 1.36 million tons per year. But here is the tragic part. In 2024, the country was only utilizing half of that capacity, actually producing a meager 680,000 tons. Meanwhile, the American appetite for this metal is voracious. The U.S. imported over 4.8 million tons of crude and semi-manufactured aluminum products. And in 2024, who do you think supplied the lion and Oppo's share of that? Canada, providing 2.6 million tons of that total. The policymakers who drafted the tariff assumed that higher prices would magically cause old American smelters to rise from the ashes. But the Aluminum Association's own internal research concluded something devastating. Even if you could wave a magic wand and bring every single idled, rusting U.S. smelter back online tomorrow morning, restarting all of them would only meet around 15% of the current 4 million metric ton supply gap. It is a drop in the bucket. Yes, there is one new smelter currently being built in Oklahoma. It is a big deal locally because it would be only the second brand new smelter to be built in the United States in the last 45 years. But it is not a savior. It is expected to be operational in 2030 at the absolute earliest, assuming there are no delays. Furthermore, its massive electricity supply contract, the lifeblood of any smelter, has not even been finalized yet. The harsh reality that Washington refused to accept is that the reason new smelters are not being built in America is not because of environmentalists, and it is not because of regulatory obstruction or red tape. It is simply the inescapable cost of electricity. U.S. industrial electricity rates are currently 32% higher than what they pay up in Canada. Furthermore, American labor costs are 31% higher. You cannot tariff your way out of that math. Century Aluminum, a major domestic player, was forced to permanently close its massive Hawesville, Kentucky smelter in 2024. They stated specifically that rising energy costs made the plant economically unviable. And remember, that closure happened before the tariffs were even enacted. So, who is paying the price for this massive misalignment of policy and reality? The American consumer and the American manufacturer. To see this, you only need to look at one hyper-specific economic indicator, the Midwest Premium. For the uninitiated, aluminum is priced globally on the London Metal Exchange. But if you actually want physical delivery of that metal to a factory in the American Midwest, you have to pay a surcharge on top of that global price. That surcharge is the Midwest Premium, and it factors in regional supply, transport, and crucially, tariffs. It tells the full story of the American industrial economy in one single number. Before the tariffs hit, the Midwest Premium sat at relatively manageable, predictable levels. It was a cost of doing business, but it wasn't an Oppo's crippling. However, after the initial 25% tariff hit in March 2025, that premium rose sharply. Executives started sweating. Then, after the devastating 50% tariff dropped in June 2025, the premium didn't an Oppo's just rise. It launched into the stratosphere, hitting record levels. By November of 2025, as the supply squeeze really took hold, the Midwest Premium reached an all-time high of $1,950 per ton. And then the Middle East War started. By February 2026, the premium violently broke past $2,182 per ton. For the commodity nerds out there, that meant it surpassed the massive psychological threshold of $1 per pound for the first time in recorded history. When you combine the global base price with that inflated domestic premium, U.S. buyers were suddenly paying an all-in price exceeding $5,340 per ton. Just between February and May of 2025 alone, American aluminum prices shot up an astonishing 139% compared to the prices being paid by their competitors over in Europe. Who absorbs that cost? Everyone. The manufacturers stamping out aluminum cans for your craft beer and soda. The automotive giants in Detroit stamping out body panels for the F-150. The aerospace companies building the next generation of commercial jets. The construction firms ordering massive extrusion elements for commercial real estate. Every single downstream consumer of aluminum took a massive financial hit. Some of the bigger corporations were able to pass those costs directly on to you and me, fueling inflation at the retail level. But many smaller, specialized manufacturers couldn't and Oppo's pass it on. They just had to eat the margin, halt expansion, or lay off workers. The prestigious Canadian CD Howe Institute published an incredibly detailed economic analysis of this entire fiasco. Their conclusion was stated with sobering clarity. Canadian aluminum cannot be replaced rapidly. It is physically impossible. Therefore, U.S. importers are going to be forced into a brutal choice. They will either have to continue sourcing from Canada and pay the extortionate 50% penalty, or they will have to drastically reduce their own industrial output. The report clearly stated that the United States simply does not have the productive domestic capacity that could quickly and cheaply ramp up, nor are there many other global sources capable of filling this massive gap, especially now that the Middle East is offline. But as if all of this wasn't and oppos bad enough for the American economy, there is a final, crushing dimension to this story. This is the piece of the puzzle that guarantees Europe will hold onto this advantage for the rest of the decade, and it involves a little acronym called CBAM. On January 1, 2026, right in the middle of all this chaos, Europe and oppos Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, entered its definitive, legally binding phase. If you run a business that touches international trade, you need to know what this is. CBAM is, essentially, the European Union and oppos aggressive new carbon tax on imports. They are trying to decarbonize their economy, and they refuse to let dirty foreign industries undercut their strict environmental laws. For the global aluminum market, CBAM is an absolute earthquake. It dictates that every single ton of metal entering the European market from outside the EU now carries a specific, calculated carbon charge based entirely on the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of its production process. Suddenly, the playing field is entirely tilted. High-carbon aluminum from places like China, India, or other producers that rely heavily on burning coal to power their smelters now face steep, often prohibitive CBAM penalty costs just to get their metal into Rotterdam or Hamburg. But what about that low-carbon aluminum from Quebec? The metal produced almost entirely on the back of massive, renewable, roaring hydroelectric power. The metal with the lowest carbon footprint of any major aluminum-producing region in the entire world? Under the new European laws, it pays almost absolutely nothing. Quebec's 8 massive smelters churn out 2.9 million tons annually with what the industry group Quebec rightly boasts as the lowest carbon footprint on the planet. And they aren't and oppos even stopping there. A massive joint venture between Alcoa and Rio Tinto, called Ely-Cis, is currently commercializing a revolutionary new smelting technology right there in Canada. This new tech aims to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions from the smelting process entirely, replacing them with pure oxygen as the only byproduct. This means that Canada didn't and oppos just get incredibly lucky on the timing of a geopolitical crisis. They spent decades building a structurally superior, environmentally pristine product that arrived at the exact, precise moment in history that Europe needed it the absolute most. The implementation of CBAM has essentially created a massive, decisive, legally binding commercial advantage for Canadian aluminum within the European market. And let me be clear, this advantage is not going to disappear when the war in the Middle East finally ends. European buyers now have a massive financial and legal incentive to aggressively prefer Canadian aluminum over any alternatives from high-emission producers in Asia or elsewhere. Furthermore, because of the Trump tariffs pushing the metal across the Atlantic in 2025, these European buyers already have deeply established, battle-tested supply relationships with the Canadian producers. These relationships have what we in the business call, and quote, inertia, and quote, the complex logistics infrastructure spanning the Atlantic has already been built. The deep water ports have been modified. The multi-year, ironclad contracts have already been signed and notarized. So, let us summarize the absolute tragic irony of this situation. The 50% tariff was loudly and proudly intended to protect American industry and stick it to the Canadians. What it actually accomplished, in reality, was accelerating Canada and oppos vital diversification away from an over-reliance on the volatile U.S. market. It permanently cemented Canada as Europe and oppos primary, favored source of essential low-carbon aluminum. And worst of all, it left massive American manufacturers scrambling, competing desperately for a severely constrained supply of metal that their own government helped push away, forcing them to pay extortionate prices they simply cannot avoid. The numbers at the end of the day close this argument with brutal finality. Canada produced 3.3 million tons of aluminum in 2024. The United States is currently sitting on a massive shortfall, short by 4 million tons every single year. The Middle East just violently lost up to 3 million tons of its annual capacity, potentially for 12 to 18 months or even longer depending on the damage. Europe is staring down the barrel of a 5.6 million ton deficit this year alone. The overall global supply shortfall sits at a terrifying 2.2 million tons. And because of all of this, the U.S. Midwest premium just crossed an unprecedented $2,182 per ton. None of these numbers are random accidents. None of this is just bad luck. They are the direct, cumulative, mathematically predictable outcome of a tariff policy that arrogantly treated Canada and OPPO's highly integrated aluminum industry as a cheap political lever. Washington tried to pull that lever only to discover, tragically too late, that it wasn't an OPPO's lever at all. It was a load-bearing wall holding up the entire North American manufacturing sector. Yes, the horrific war in the Middle East will eventually end. The diplomats will step in, the Strait of Hormuz will eventually be cleared of threats and reopened to global shipping. The massive, energy-rich Gulf smelters will rebuild their damaged infrastructure and fire back up. But the massive, globe-spanning trade flows that the Trump tariff set into motion will not simply reverse themselves. You cannot unring this bell. Canada and OPPO's massive aluminum industry now possesses exactly what it always lacked: a desperately hungry, structurally dependent European customer base. They have a massive, legally mandated CBAM advantage that locks out their dirtiest competitors. They hold highly lucrative, long-term supply agreements. And frankly, they have absolutely no particular economic incentive to return their entire massive production output to an American market that capriciously hit them with a 50% penalty and had the audacity to call it fair trade. What the White House proudly presented to the voting public as a masterstroke of economic leverage turned out to be the greatest industrial gift anyone could have given to Brussels. Europe graciously accepted that gift, wrapped in a bow of hydroelectric power. And today, American industry is the one paying for it, to the tune of $5,340 per ton, and climbing higher every single day. That is the reality of the global economy. You cannot cheat the math, and you cannot tariff your way out of a deficit. If you found this deep dive breakdown useful, if it helped you understand why the cost of building, manufacturing, and living in America is going through the roof right now, please share this episode. Send it to that colleague who is still scratching their head wondering why American manufacturing costs are spiraling out of control despite all the political promises. And seriously, hit that subscribe button. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting beneath our feet every single week, and this story is far from finished. Neither is the next one. We will be right back here tracking the fallout, following the money, and cutting through the political spin to tell you what is actually happening. Thank you for tuning in to Daily Gossip. Keep your eyes on the markets, and I will see you all very soon.